is good, y'all? It is your host for this episode, Kodey Stoffer, for the Playmakers Corner podcast. And I got some more season previews and some news rolling in here. So we're going to take a look at the schedules from last year as we do go over how a team did in the previous season. And then we're going to talk about some of the contributing seniors, in this case, the class of 24 key departures, some players who are returning and hoping to make some noise again, and then taking a look at the schedule for this season and projecting the wins and losses based off that info. So without further ado, let's go ahead and talk about our very first program, this Lincoln squad here out of Denver. This squad last season did struggle, but they did manage to pull off a win in Week 3 with a one-score dub over Alameda, 28-20, but unfortunately got routed by every other opponent in another tough season here. Trying to sift through some of these stats, they were pretty incomplete here, but from what I could gather, they lose their lead back, Beltran, to graduation after rushing for the most yards on the team. And then the top three receivers in Josiah Grant, Preston Herbert, and Eliseo Beltran here all graduate here. And Preston Herbert was the only player defensively to record multiple sacks. So they lose all of that. Meanwhile, as far as returning playmakers go, King Stansel was second in carries, eclipsing 100 yards in a single game at one point. He also countered by defensively leading the team with 4.7 tackles a game and forced 4 turnovers with 3 fumble recoveries and an interception. Now, Ash Myers has some work to do if he comes back, as does Ezekiel Juarez, in what should be a competition heading into the season at the quarterback position. The top 4 tacklers in Stansel, Neva, Reyes, and Fuentes were all underclassmen and look to make a return here. And then you have Isaiah DeLeon here, I believe is how you say that, who made an impact as only a sophomore, and his 230-pound frame will be leaned on heavily, probably going both ways his junior year. So let's go ahead and take a look at their competition for this season here. They open up down south in Woodland Park. Woodland Park, they are a consistent program here. I do think that Woodland Park probably wins that game as against Lincoln's first opponent in 2A. Then play at home versus Peyton. Peyton is actually a team that had some very interesting young contributors last season, and I think that they just get a little bit more out of those returners than Lincoln here and get a win as well. They then are at home versus Kennedy. I unfortunately think that this is also a loss. They then have Arvada on the schedule. Now, Arvada is a team that I am going to talk about later that is losing a lot. However, they are still returning some more dynamic playmakers. So I think that one on the road is probably a loss, but probably one of their more winnable games, potentially, looking at this schedule. They are then at home versus TCA. I don't think that that's fantastic. And then they are at home versus Devlin. I don't think that is a win neither. And then looking at Denver West, Mitchell and Alameda. Denver West, still going to be a tough game. They're returning some talent as well, but Mitchell and Alameda are going to be interesting. Those are other teams that kind of struggled last year, so I kind of view this league outside of TCA and Devlin, and even to some extent Denver West, kind of a rebuild / pick-me-up for the likes of Lincoln, Mitchell, and Alameda. That would explain why they're kind of so spread out a little bit as far as having some teams in the metro area and then some teams literally in Colorado Springs. So that's kind of my lookout for Lincoln here. So that basically gives them a window of wins anywhere between 0 to 3. But I'm going to say that they probably fall in that 1 and 8 range over the course of these 9 games. Maybe 2 and 7. Now, moving on here, we're going to talk about the Devlin Jaguars here. And, to start the season last year, they kind of stumbled out the gate a little bit against the likes of Elizabeth and Forge Christian before bouncing back with back-to-back wins that would put them at 500. They would then continue to basically alternate losses and wins with an L to Platte Valley, a crazy 9-point win over Bennett, a loss to Wellington, and then 2 wins to close the season, scoring over 30 points both times to finish with a winning record from last year. And so looking at some of the production that they're going to have to replace, they do lose the top 2 receivers, but Bradley Fuller's production is going to be a bit tougher as he had 16 touchdown receptions last year, and that's just going to be incredibly hard to duplicate, I think, from any one player. And once you throw in Balser and fellow senior Cole Howers combined 60 receptions and 600 plus yards, all walking across the stage, that just leaves a huge vacuum for receivers. The secondary is also being gutted as Bryce Woolley and Russell Balser's 4 and 2, respectively, interceptions, along with 3 more picks from other seniors, make up 75% of turnovers on interceptions, and tacklers 2 through 5 on the leaderboard for this squad all graduate, and 6 out of the top 8 tacklers all graduated, including Fuller, who had the second highest TFL count at 5 tackles for loss. Why do I not sound alarmed, though? Well, that's because these returning playmakers are some of the best in 2A, in my opinion. You get Kevin Felden. He's an awesome quarterback. He was in his sophomore season last year, and he did really well, throwing for over 1,700 yards and 25 scores. Once he owns in on that completion percentage and cuts down on those turnovers, he could definitely be an OPOY caliber player on the 2A level, IMO. You also get Noah Allen here. Now, he didn't rush for a ton of yards as he was just under 400 yards and 2 scores, but he's somebody who could take a step forward his senior year and provide this offense with some good balance. You also get Adam Nguyen here. He was the leading junior receiver with 324 yards and 4 scores, while also being a part of a little trickery throwing and running the football, just being an overall offensive weapon. You also bring back Kafoy Fiadanu here. Sorry if I'm saying that first name wrong once again, because I feel like I always butcher it here. But Fiadanu here has been one of the premier defenders on the 2A level since his freshman year, back when he was a newcomer of the year candidate, consistently in all PMC conversations. And, just upload that film so we could truly evaluate and see if you have a chance at a top 5 list here. But last season, getting back to that, he recorded over 100 tackles, as well as 15 for loss, and then he was responsible for nearly half of the team's total sacks at 8. So somebody who can bring the pressure and somebody who can make a ton of plays in the run game as well. He's really evolved to be a more well-rounded defender in a few different aspects. You also get Sam Warren. That's one of 3 players who come back who had an interception, along with fellow freshman Darren Souza and incoming senior Michael Oren, who will look to take a huge step forward and try and fill some of the void that was left by that graduating class. So let's go ahead and look at this season here that includes the likes of Fort Lupton, Conifer, Forge Christian, and University for their non-league play here. I think that this is a very interesting non-league play here. Conifer, I think, is going to continue to be tough, especially because they're going to play keep away from this Devlin offense here, and that's going to provide some difficulties. Fort Lupton is a team that has ran a very balanced approach over the past few years, and having both of those on the road, having to go way north and then west side here into the mountains a little bit, I think that those are both going to be tough environments to play. I think that they probably go 1-1 in this, but then luckily they are at home against the likes of Forge Christian and University. I think that Forge Christian is going to be one of the more surprising teams potentially on the 1A level, and you'll hear about that in just a couple of episodes here. But University here, they are consistently a really good team. They graduate a very big class of 24, so this game on the road might present a challenge for this squad here, but they do a good job of preparing that next level to go ahead and make plays once they roll up. So, we're going to stay tuned on that, but I think this is probably another 1-1 situation. I think that loss is probably to University here. So we're looking at entering league play at about 500 here, but in league, they should do significantly better here. I think that they need, no excuses basically, need to be Alameda, Lincoln, Mitchell, as well as Denver West, honestly. I think that you go 4-1 in league here. I don't know if they beat TCA. They do get them at home. However, TCA is just one of the most stacked teams, and I really like what they have returning in a few different areas, and they do a good job at replenishing that talent and consistently being a contender on that 2A level. So, I think that is something to kind of consider. And, if they go 2-2 out of league and 4-1 in league, that puts them at about 6-3 for a projected record here. But as far as window of wins go, maybe they get one more or one less. So I'm going to say a 5-7 window of wins here with a projected overall record of 6-3 for the Devlin Jaguars. And that should hopefully be enough to make the postseason, but some of their league opponents might severely undermine that, so they got to perform outside of league, and they got to perform well in the ones that they do win, and they got to compete in any of the ones that they might not. For some of those other members of the Metro 2A, you're going to have to listen to Coach V's episode, I believe, that has those other squads. But we're going to move on and talk about one of the really interesting divisions/leagues here, and that's the 2A East. And we're going to start it off with none other than the Kent Denver Sun Devils here. Looking back at last season, their season went almost as good as you could hope for, as they went on an absolute tear, beating Platte Valley on the road by 2 scores to start the season, and then ripping off 4 straight wins, scoring no less than 46 before beating a tough Elizabeth team on the road 17-7. They would then get a 50-burger win, and following that, dominate TCA at home 36-14. Pitch another shutout win to complete a perfect season. This would be good enough for a 2 seed where they would host in the opening round, but unfortunately would get upset 31-28 by Eaton, and arguably the most stunning loss in the Colorado postseason in the opening round. This was one that had all of us shook, as we had actually made it out to a couple of Kent Denver performances throughout the season here. Coach V and I making it out to that TCA game, being very impressed by what they showed on both sides of the ball and how dominant they looked. But, this squad had a lot to learn, I think, from that game, hopefully, and they still put up 28 points. But, they're going to have to replace some production from the class of 24 and take some of these returning playmakers and, hopefully make another run at state. But let's talk about why I think that could be the ceiling for this team, and talk about first what they need to replace, as they do need to replace the top 4 receivers. They were all seniors, headlined by Alex Padalino. He had 6 touchdowns. Nick Bucknow, and he is actually a top 5 class of 24 PMC tight end. So, that's a very prestigious position here. Henry Guttrich, who had over 1,000 yards combined, and then Augustine, who had over 160 yards. On top of that, 9 of the top 10 tacklers graduate, taking with them a lot of TFLs, a lot of solo tackles, and a handful of assisted tackles. Not to mention that Padalito, Guttrich, and Yates all had multiple interceptions last season and a few more fumble recoveries that leave. So I know that I kind of sprinted through that, and it's like glossing over a lot of production here. But let's talk about some of the playmakers that I'm excited to see make noise this year and help lead this next group to another successful season here. And that starts with the 2-way monster that is Trip Skews here. He recently captured a CSU camp MVP in that line section. He is an awesome tackle who's going to provide a ton of time on the offensive side, but defensively, he is just an absolute wrecking ball when it comes to the offenses. It doesn't even really matter if you double team him. He will still dominate. He will get TFLs in the run game. He will get hurries on the quarterback. Whenever he does get to sack the quarterback, it is a destructive play, and it is something that can get the rest of the team super duper excited, super infectious, his playmaking for the rest of the squad. He also returned under center Yanni Balafas here. He comes back after a sophomore effort that saw him complete a crazy 73% of his passes for 19 scores and over 1,700 yards. You also get back Wyatt Walker at running back, who is dominant, averaging 6.3 yards per carry on 128 rushes, finding pay dirt 13 times, and was also a very valid check down option who will keep this offense steady. So I just like some of the pillars of this team that are going to return. You get some depth at line that is going to be coming back as well. So some consistency that'll help them establish the run game, open up the pass game, and help them win up front on defense will definitely lessen the steepness, I should say, of what the secondary's responsibility is going to be and how much they need to make plays to force turnovers and get good opportunities. They won a lot of games by quite a bit last year. I don't know if we'll get as dominant of a showing this season, but this should be still a very good Sun Devils team. So let's take a look at the schedule here and see how they'll fare. They open up this season against Florence here. I do think that they should probably win this game, especially with it being at home. But Florence, they're always going to be a tough team. You got to watch out for them. They are losing a lot of production themselves, but they also are, as always, are returning some interesting prospects and players to kind of push this Ken Denver team. They then have Denver Christian and Forge Christian in back-to-back weeks. I think they should go 2-0 in those. And then at home versus Aspen, at home is always going to be an interesting setup here, especially with an Aspen team that's going to have to travel. I think that they do have some figuring out to do as far as how to slow down Henry Hurd. But on the flip side, I think that the skiers have their handful in the Skews, Balafast, Walker kind of trio that can really dominate against anybody in the state. And I do think so that is true regardless of classification for the most part. They then play Hinckley on October 5th. I do think that they should probably win that game over a 3A opponent. And so I have them going 5-0 heading into league here, maybe 4-1. And you might be asking, wait, why is this team going to be playing 5 out-of-league games and then 4 league games? Stay tuned for the end of this league segment for the addressing of that. But for starters here, let's go ahead and talk about Englewood. Englewood has a ton of turnover. We'll talk about that on this episode in just a little bit, but I am going to favor Kent Denver in that game. They then get Bennett at home. Bennett is actually, I think, going to be a really tough game because they can play keep away very, very well from the Sun Devils here and just eat up a ton of clock. But I still have the Sun Devils just barely favored with it being a home game and with who they're returning. They then have at Strasburg. I do have them favored. Strasburg is just losing a lot and jumping up to 2A. So I think by this point in the season, they will have figured some things out. Their young core will start getting it together. I just think that, this transition year on top of how much contribution they are losing is going to be quite interesting and quite a challenge, an interesting one for their squad. I then have them facing off against Elizabeth at home. I think that they repeat this and win once again here. I think that Elizabeth is probably their strongest league opponent who could beat them, but I think that they just have the correct opponent scheduled at home and the correct opponent scheduled away that kind of plays to their favor throughout this whole season. So really, I am projecting Kent Denver to go 9-0. However, I think on the floor of this, they lose maybe 2 of these league games and maybe that opener to Florence. So I think at worst that their window of wins is 6-9, and they should have a nice season. Now we're going to talk about one of their probably more competitive fellow league mates here in Bennett here from Bennett, Colorado. That is the Tigers. Look, last year they had a window of wins of 4-6, and they just struggled to score, honestly, outside of a nearly 70-point performance that helped them beat Prospect Ridge Academy. But they dropped Weld Central by 23, Sterling by 20, BLA by 30, and just really weren't as close until they played Devlin that they lost by 9. That would be their best margin for the remainder of the season as they went 1-8 during the 2023 fall season. And so, obviously we look at this team and wonder, why did they struggle so much? Well, they had a lot of underclassmen getting some serious snaps because outside of Tristan Kronk, 834 yards, 624 return yards, those 834 were rushing, by the way. He had a ton of all-purpose yards. He was a huge contributor on defense with 45 tackles and 5 of those being for loss. He ran for double-digit touchdowns, but he's kind of the only senior who was a major contributor who did graduate because the likes of Aaron Driggs and Austin Steers were 2 and 3 in rushing yards, who combined for over 1,000 with Driggs at 6 scores, and they come back. You have sophomore stud Cougar Kronk, probably related here, who ran for 273 yards and 2 scores as a sophomore. Austin Steers caught for over 400 yards and a few scores last season and returns for a junior effort. Brody Haas experienced, quite a bit his junior year and coming into his senior season. He has 575 yards and 6 touchdowns to 4 picks under his belt. He's just got to up that completion percentage and obviously improve that TD to INT ratio. And then the defense on the heels of Haas, who had 80 tackles and led the team, Steers' 41 tackles, returns everyone who recorded a single tackle outside of 2 guys. That is insane to only lose 2 seniors on the entire defense who had any tackles, one of those being Tristan Cronk that I mentioned earlier. This defense, who allowed a lot of points last season, should, in theory, improve drastically with the experience and with the cohesiveness and communication, including another off-season of communication. This Bennett team should be significantly improved. So let's go ahead and take a look at their schedule here and see what this window of wins might be. First game, they play against Weld Central. This game should be a lot closer, honestly. And they also get the Bennett fit of playing at home, potentially. So, I think that this one could go either way. At Kennedy did show flashes last year, but I do think that this is a very winnable game for Bennett, but I believe in my Kennedy preview, this could potentially go either way. They then are at Lamar. Lamar's always a super competitive team in 2A here, and so I don't know if this is a winnable game, but, it is a winnable game. It is just on the road, which makes it tough, but I am going to favor probably, I'll lean Bennett for now. They are then at home versus Lyman. Lyman is graduating a lot. In theory, this should be a win for Bennett. However, I just have a little bit more faith in that Lyman coaching staff being able to maximize the sophomores that they have, especially by week 4 of the season here. And then they have Highland High School here. Highland is going to have some playmakers, but I am going to favor Bennett in that game before they head into league play against the likes of Englewood, Elizabeth, Kent Denver, and Strasburg. I think that they should beat Englewood. I don't know if they're going to beat Elizabeth. Elizabeth is returning a ton of defense, and I think that contrasts nicely with what Bennett is bringing back. They're just going to have to score some points, but I think that Elizabeth is kind of geared to win low-scoring games in some of those instances. Kent Denver, I think that I definitely still favor Kent Denver and the top-end talent that they bring back, as they have a ton of all-PMC guys and award watch list guys and stuff like that. And then Strasburg, this is the battle for the bridge. This is going to be very interesting. Now, over the past few years, Strasburg has kind of dominated this rivalry here, but if there ever was a year that Bennett could make a push, it would be now. So at home, it's going to be an electric environment, but there could be a lot at stake too, potentially in this game for that last playoff spot. I think that Strasburg and Bennett are going to be the 2 teams that are playing for third in this league, personally, and I'll kind of touch on that in just a minute. But, I think that this could be a potential sneak-in game, especially for Bennett, that I think scheduled some pretty quality opponents for the most part and could be punching up here. But, it's one of those things where this team was so young and struggled so much last year that I still got to see how they open up the season. I got to see which foot they start off on because, if they stumble out of the gate, this could be kind of a long season where you only win like 3 games, honestly. But on the high end here, I think that there's really only 3 games that you cannot win in any universe here. So I'm going to give Bennett a projected window of wins of 3 to 6. And I'm going to say that over the course of this season that they go 5-4, and that should make for a good year for this squad. Now, as for a team that is going through some insane change, let's take a look at Englewood here. Last year, the Pirates kind of beat the teams they were supposed to and then dropped some tough games to miss the playoffs, going 4-5. But in this offseason, lost their head coach and their star player. Last season, like I said, the teams that they were supposed to kind of be Sheridan, Littleton, Lincoln, and Alameda, all by big margins, but would lose a 2-score shootout to Arvada early and then struggled in league outside of a devastating 1-point loss to Denver West that definitely dashed their hopes of an extended season. Now, you cannot look ahead to the future without a different lens, as Coach Campbell and his son Carson have packed up for Vista Peak Prep, and losing a multi-year starter at quarterback poised for a big senior season and a long-time coach in Colorado is very hard to scale. You also lose the leading receiver who had 35 receptions for 666 yards and 11 touchdowns. That's some pretty insane production to lose. You also lose Jace Prancy and Dane Quintana here. They combined for 500 yards and a score for each century mark in their senior send-off. Prance's senior duties included leading the team defensively with 12 tackles for loss, and then Rick Johnson was right behind Prance here in total tackles with 47, and those guys only headlined the class of 24. That's 6 of the top 8 tacklers graduating. Prance did lead the team in sacks as well at 5 that will have to be replaced, and then Deaver, Dominic that was a heavy defender in the pass game, notching 3 interceptions. As far as some stability that is maintained by this program, Deion Robinson was a running back last season who was capable of ripping off some big runs and got to 730 yards and 7 scores, while also notching 229 receiving yards and a touchdown. He also returned Logan Mael here, who was a sophomore, actually captaining the ship here with 65 tackles and 10 of those being for loss. And then Deion Robinson kind of pops back up here as he doubled as a 7 TFL contributor. And last but not least, Grant Pebbles here comes back his senior year, looking to pick up where he left off with 6 forced turnovers and 4 of those as interceptions. So this is going to be a year of transition. There's still some winnable games looking at the schedule. I'm looking at not necessarily banning Lewis Academy, especially with that one being on the road. I am going to favor BLA, even though they are also going to look for a new coach. But I just like some of the two-way threats that they are returning. I'm looking at the likes of a Chase Reel, who is a potential PMC. Well, he was a PMC award candidate at times, so that's going to be tough to kind of combat. I don't know if Englewood necessarily has the firepower for that. Hinckley, I am going to favor almost any team against Hinckley until proven otherwise. Denver West is kind of weird that it's super early here, and this schedule is super Mod Podge here. But anyways, Denver West here. I think that Denver West is probably favored for me, honestly, just with where the impact is coming from. But Englewood could definitely win this game. Versus Littleton here. Love my guys over at Littleton High School trying to build something, but I know that they did lose a really good player, honestly, and so that's going to make it tough. They also have to play this game on the road. This should be a close game, in my opinion, closer than last season, but I do think that Englewood can kind of just rely on simplistic football to get by on this one. They then play at home versus Alameda. I think that this should be a win for Englewood, and then we jump into the league. I unfortunately think that Englewood is kind of at the bottom of this pecking order. I think that Bennett, Kent Denver, Strasburg, and Elizabeth all just, I feel more comfortable with the consistency that I've seen with these teams, whether it's players that are coming back or whether it's coaching. I just feel a little bit more comfortable with where Englewood is at, in where these other teams are at in regards to Englewood, honestly. Stay tuned for the rest of these previews, obviously, for especially my Strasburg reasoning, as they just have some interesting contributors coming back. If they could win any game, I would probably say Strasburg just because of how many departures they had last year, but I still have Strasburg favored in that. And then, interestingly enough, kind of weird, they have a game against Platte Canyon scheduled for the end of the season. I'm not sure if that is valid, as that is after league play, if they're just getting in more reps, if that's going to be for maybe just like a JV scrimmage. I don't know. It's interesting that that could happen during a potential postseason. So I'm going to just ignore that game for now until this schedule is kind of a bit more stable. But anyways, looking at their window of wins here, I mentioned that they probably should win 3 of these games, and then I'm leaving room for up to 5 here. I think that 3 is the floor, and I think that that is where they're going to sit, honestly. but I like the wow of 3 to 5 just in case they pull off an upset within their league and maybe one more on the road to start the season if they start nice and simple and jump out to a big lead to start. So that's going to be my program preview on this squad out here in Englewood over in my neck of the woods. Now, the last participant of this league in the 2024 season is brand new to 2A here, or at least compared to last year, and that is Strasburg High School here. And yeah, this squad last season in 1A, had a struggle early on, going 1-2 out the gate with losses to Holyoke and Lyman, with a win over Wiggins sandwiched in between. But boy, talk about a team catching on fire. They would dominate for the rest of the season, and especially in league, averaging 58 points per game, and caught fire heading into the playoffs, beating North Fork 21-0, whooping Gunnison 56-14, and pulling off an insane W over Ray 28-27 to cap an improbable run to the chip. But unfortunately, that momentum would not carry all the way to Pueblo, as they would fall to the Badgers for the second time that season, falling just short of their ultimate goal. But this goal was very possible, and this magical run was definitely a product of this class of 24 core that was super special here. Can't talk about this class without talking about quarterback Landon Martin. He nearly threw for 2,700 yards and rushed for over 1,000 during his career, with a combined 54 touchdowns, and with his senior season being the creme de la creme of those performances, especially on the ground, where he complimented Thomas Devlin. Now, Devlin ran for 18 scores, and Landon Martin ran for 18 scores as well, but Devlin led the team in carries and yards with 1,111 to cap off his senior year. You also lose senior rusher Paul Smith, who ran for another 8 scores in his senior season, but was a dual threat here, catching 3 touchdowns and another 277 yards. You also lose leading receiver Austin Velasco, who caught over 1,000 yards from the past 2 seasons combined, and then 9 touchdowns this past season, having a very high impact and being a great jump ball receiver on the 1A level. And then overall, the top 3 receivers and top 5 running backs all depart, and that doesn't even address the defense, who loses the top 5 tacklers, headlined by DJ Cannon, who had 100+, and then the real havoc wreckers here, Devlin, Dickens, Velasco, they all had over 10 tackles for loss. Al Dickens being one of the premier defensive linemen on the 1A football level, and somebody who's going to take his talents to Chadron State. This was a very talented team, a decent amount of college looks for the next level of football, and one that made it to the state championship in 1A and is ready to take a bite out of 2A here. Now, some of the players who are going to be leading that charge into 2A include the likes of Jorge Parra and Ian Ross. These guys last year combined for 99 tackles, including 8.5 for loss and a few sacks. You also got to look to the future here and get excited for underclassmen Cameron Manahan and Aiden Dodge. Both had 3 interceptions apiece and will look to lead this next gen of Strasburg players to a solid defense while still probably getting some touches on offense here. Manahan himself had 45 total tackles last season, and so there's going to be a lot of tackling to replace, but as far as turnovers go, you're returning a decent amount from last season. You're returning a few guys here on defense that I think can make a defense competent, and then offensively, I think that they're going to put their guys in a place to succeed scheme-wise, but they are going to have some serious uphill battles to go. I'm looking at the likes of a Platte Valley to start on the road. That Platte Valley team was pretty solid last year. That one could kind of go either way. Montezuma Cortez all the way across the entire state is kind of crazy, honestly, but when I'm looking at this Montezuma Cortez squad here, I know that they are returning some of their best playmakers last year. They have to be frustrated based off of how their season ended last year. And so I actually have Montezuma Cortez favored in that one. And I also have La Junta favored. So for Strasburg, you could be potentially looking at an 0-3 start. However, there is a great opportunity to bounce back here, as they do have to play the academy here. I think that this would be a great chance to get a win under their belt here before facing off against Wiggins and heading into league here. Now, heading into league, I do absolutely think that they beat Englewood, and I do think that they have a chance to beat Bennett and Elizabeth here. I think that this is where they could really get into a roll here, and if they catch fire at the right time, they could cause some problems for some other teams here. But if I'm looking at the schedule, I say Academy, definitely a win. I look at Englewood, definitely a win. I think that they win one of these games as far as Platte Valley, Montezuma, Bennett. I think they win one of those here. So I think that while they are making a jump, I still think that this is probably a 3-win team, but with a window of wins from 2 all the way to 5, honestly. I just think that when you play a schedule that's this tough, you probably don't win more than 5 of these games. Because, I mean, if you win 5 of these games, that means that you had to beat the likes of either Platte Valley, Montezuma Cortez, or La Junta. You have to win one of those 3. And then in league, you have to beat either Elizabeth or Kent Denver. So that's why I think that 5 is pretty safe on the window of wins here on the high end. And on the low end, I'm going to say 3. I'm going to keep it to be a pretty small window of wins and say that on the season that they go 4 and 5, they find some ways to win, and maybe their strength of schedule is enough to squeeze them into the postseason, even with a losing record. I think that that is possible. Now, as for the team that is not currently in this league, but was originally slated to be in this league, that was supposed to be Robert F. Smith Steam was supposed to have a team here, but unfortunately, it looks like there's a little bit of controversy here. I'm just going to read from this article and then just kind of react here, as Brandon Pryor was banned from district property by Denver Public Schools. He was a co-founder of Robert F. Smith STEAM Academy and was a volunteer coach for Far Northeast. He is not allowed to coach, and he's prohibited from volunteering or participating in any district events, and is only allowed access to the schools that his sons go to and events open to the general public. In a detailed letter that DPS sent Pryor last week, they said, quote, "This letter serves to inform you that your repeated abusive, bullying, threatening, and intimidating contact directed at staff at DPS or the district has been inappropriate, harmful to the district's educational programming, and in violation of DPS administration policies, KFA, KI, and K and G, which individually and collectively prohibit, amongst other things, disruption of teaching and or administrative operations, and the creation of unsafe/threatening environments for our students and staff members," end quote. Now, Pryor has responded saying none of this is true. Everything I've said is protected under the First Amendment. I haven't threatened anyone. I haven't physically attacked anyone or harmed anyone, end quote. And while DPS didn't have any additional comment, they did provide a letter Pryor sent and 30 items of supporting documentation, including social media posts. However, this has caused an uproar in the DPS community. There were some protests here outside of Robert F. Smith asking for the reinstatement, basically, of Pryor, as he is considered by the community an advocate for a lot of these younger students as far as getting them resources, getting them attention, and taking care of the community. And he is very passionate here, even having called at one point, quote, "The entire leadership team at Montbello needs to be fired," end quote. So Pryor here seems very passionate. He seems like he cares a lot about the students here. And so without him, there's just no football team and no advocacy for the completion of a football team. So that's why they will not be participating here. Now, I do think it's tough that these kids don't get to participate, obviously. And, Far Northeast as a concept, combining kids from multiple schools, it just doesn't really give you a chance to build that school spirit, that buy-in, that camaraderie that's just a little bit tighter whenever it's for your school or community. So, I just think it's very interesting what's going on here, and DPS not being able to provide a solution or a stopgap opportunity is just a little interesting here. Now, I'm not sure, and like I said, I am just reading what has been read to me from 9 News here, and then following it up with my opinion that it just seems like there's maybe a little bit more to this situation than meets the eye. But for the time being, no Robert F. Smith STEAM Academy on the 2A level and not here in this league. Now, one of our last teams to discuss who is playing this year is Arvada here. Talking about last year, it was a very good year to be a Bulldog. They rode an electric offense last season to their highest win total in at least 20 years with some fun games, beating Littleton in a wild 35-28 game that went to triple overtime. That was one of my longer nights on the pod, as that was just such a back and forth, crazy, turnover-ridden, high-scoring, big play, crazy pickup kind of just excitement and electricity at LPS. That was a Thursday night, I want to say, well spent. There's also a 48-36 win over Englewood. They unfortunately lost a tough one-score game here before getting a tough one-score win over Middle Park. But, following those, actually that other one-score game was a win. My apologies here. And they started off the season 4-0. They would then lose their first game of the season to Brush before bouncing back with a win over Timnath. And then the next two games would decide their fate, as they unfortunately lost to University. But the real nail in the coffin was what I would probably argue was an upset, losing 35-21 to Sterling here. And while they did win their last game, it would be in vain, as they missed the playoffs, going 6-3. They are losing some big contributors from last year here. Trevor Lucero was one of the premier offensive players last season in 2A, throwing for over 2,000 yards and 22 scores. And some fellow seniors he was dotting up for those yards were the likes of Christian Lake and Brandon Martinez. Those two receivers combined for 900 yards, and Lake found Pater thrice catching the ball. You also lose Lucero's 543 yards and 7 rushing touchdowns, and his running mate back there, Gabriel Munguia, who had 823 yards and 6 scores himself in the running game that helped provide balance to this offense. Munguia, Lake, Martinez, and Barajas all had over 130 combined solo tackles, with Munguia and Lake having 25 TFLs between the two of them, and Lake going crazy rushing the quarterback, leading all Bulldogs with 12 sacks at defensive end, and then Munguia here staying aware, keeping his head on the swivel, leading the team with 4 forced fumbles. Now, Martinez was one of only 3 players to record interceptions, getting 2 of them and 3 pass breakups. And lastly, Josiah Barajas here was sturdy in the secondary with an absurd 22 pass deflections that will be sorely missed. Now, transitioning here to players that are coming back, you cannot talk about the Arvada Bulldogs without bringing up Jariah Arellano here. He has cemented himself a spot on all PMC and watch list time, with an incredible sophomore season going for 828 yards and a whopping 14 scores, making whoever is under center's job easier next year. He was dominant at LPS in the first time that I got to see him, and I was thoroughly impressed with what he brings to a football team. You also bring back defender PJ Sierra, who led this squad in interceptions with 3 of them. And then Yahin Villegas here, who returns for a senior season. Yahin. That tries to one-up his 3 sack and 7 TFL total and continue to lead this team in tackles his senior year. Meanwhile, Noah Reed had 5 TFLs his junior year out of his 20 total. So a couple of studs on defense coming back, and then an offensive playmaker that you can get involved in a variety of ways, as far as throwing him the football, throwing screens, letting him cook after the catch, getting some jet sweeps involved in there. So definitely something interesting to toy with here. Looking at their schedule, they open up against Basalt in Basalt. I do not think this is a win before they come back down south to play Mitchell on the road. I do think that in Mitchell's first year as a varsity program, this should be a win if you could just get creative in getting Jariah the ball. Now, versus Pueblo County, this is probably a loss, but I think that they bounce back with a win against Lincoln to go 2-2 before heading into their league here. Some of those games involving Brush, Weld Central, and Sterling. Out of those games, Weld Central is the one that is on the road. But I do think that they have the biggest uphill battle in this division outside of the academy here. I honestly think that they probably go 1-4 over the course of this, thus making their overall season record 3-6. I do think that they could win Probably one more game if they sneak one against like a Fort Lupton, maybe two with Weld Central. So I'll say a window of wins of 3-5, but I do think that this is the year that they kind of take a step backwards, kind of regress to the mean, and yeah, they probably go 3-6 for their predicted record here as far as how they'll look overall. And now for the last recap of the episode, we're going to talk about Grand Valley here. And to start their season last year, they had a very exciting 52-26 win over Ellicott to start the year. However, they would drop their next two games to Cedar Ridge and North Fork, I think both of those being playoff teams on the 1A level, before bouncing back in the win column with another exciting win over Manual at 46-22 to sit at 500. This was unfortunately the beginning of the end here, as their 500 record would dissipate here and their winning would dissipate here, as they would allow over 40 points per game in 40 of their last 5 games and lose to Cole Ridge by a touchdown. Talking about graduating seniors, they do lose Philip Hoyt here, 47 tackles in his senior season to lead all class of 24 players in snaps and impact, with 6 of those being for loss, while also tying the team lead for sacks. They also lose Braden Allen, who is impactful defensively with a pick and 4 pass breakups. Returning playmakers, though, is an extensive category here for Grand Valley, and one that should get you partially excited. You cannot really discuss the Cardinal season without talking about Andrew Horner. 2 interceptions, 3 pass breakups, offensively 985 yards, and 17 combined touchdowns through the ground and passing. If he could take one more step forward, this team could be serious with the proper progression here. And that doesn't even make up or address Mason Shopner here with a good season, probably MVP material here for this team, having led both in rushing and receiving yards, and along with his 220 kick return yards, had over 1,000 all-purpose yards, being a threat in every facet of the ball, not just offense and defense, but return, as I previously mentioned, but defensively was a demon as well, going for 63 tackles, 8 of those being for loss, 2.5 sacks, an interception, and a partridge in a pear tree. This was just a very, very good defensive season from Mason here, as well as somebody who's going to be leaned on offensively to carry some more of the load. They also bring back Gabriel Mendoza here, the only tackler with double-digit tackles in the backfield, which adds up since he led the team by over 20 total tackles. They also have Preston Johnson, Richard Terrazas, Sion Clegg, and Camden Neal, who all come back next season and made up all but one tackler with over 40 tackles. And the next 3 guys after Neal all return in Strauss, Rugard, and Skeen here, recording a ton of tackles. Clegg here was up there for the team lead in TFLs at 7, and then 3 players in Terrazas, Neal, and Strauss all had 4. So honestly, very good season coming up, I think, for Grand Valley here. You know, I don't have this entire league, to be fair, so I think it is worth watching what kind of happens in this league. But they are going to be participating, it looks like, in the 1A Western Slope here. And so let's go ahead and talk about this upcoming season where they have Aspen to start. This is on the road. I unfortunately think that despite all the talent that Grand Valley is returning, I like Aspen's high-end talent just a little bit better, so I will favor Aspen here. They then play Cole Ridge. They should get revenge for that loss last year, and they should beat Cole Ridge this year to go 1-1 to start. They then have Moffat County and then Resurrection Christian. That is some tough scheduling. That is some devious work. I unfortunately think that they drop those 2 games, especially Res Christian, who I think is going to be absolutely insane on the 2A level. They then have Roaring Fork and Olathe. I think that these are both winnable games, especially Roaring Fork kind of went through, I mean, they had to take last year off, and then there is some interesting stories, and we'll see who sticks around at Glenwood Springs because of the bonds that they formed there and how long they see that out before returning to their homeschooler. What that is going to look like, honestly. So I think that these 2 games are potential winners, and then the likes of Cedar Ridge, North Fork, and Meeker, I think that those are going to be tougher asks just with that program history here. So I think on the low end of things, I think that Grand Valley should at least match their win total from last year with a window of wins starting at 2, However, on the high end of things, I think that there are 4 wins here. I'm going to be optimistic and say that they finish better than they did last year, with overall 3-6 being their predicted record here on the heels of a great season from Horner and Schoepner here, carrying this team to some close games. And that'll do it. It feels like a very short episode here. And part of that is just a team that couldn't participate a little bit. And it is a little bit shorter, honestly. We had 9 teams, but we got 10 more teams coming your way. And then another episode of 9 here. And then we have Gideon season previews as well coming up anywhere you listen to podcasts, be it Spotify, Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, YouTube as well, where we upload all of our episodes. Go ahead and check out, while you're at it, Coach V and Gino's season previews. And go ahead and just enjoy it and enjoy the vibes here. They did a great job doing their season previews and were right a lot of the time. So go ahead and listen to that for some insight. And we're going to also be posting a graphic on how we did on predictions last year, just so y'all see the accountability and the transparency from us here at the podcast. Football is a crazy sport to try and guess, especially with some players on the JV level stepping up, as well as some of the varsity players who may not take the strides that we're accounting for. So we're just excited to be covering this tackle football season. Stay tuned for more tackle football content anywhere that you listen to podcasts. Once again, Spotify, Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts. Go ahead and make sure that you turn on notifications and follow our podcast on any of those. And while you're following us, go ahead and do it on social media as well, at Playmakers Corner on TikTok, at Playmakers Corner on Instagram, Playmakers Corner on Facebook, and at Playmaker Corner on Twitter/X. I have been your host for this episode, Kodey Stauffer, signing off.